Thank you, Cindy. And thanks to the Center for arranging all this and for inviting me. I'm painfully aware that there are a lot of people in this audience with a lot more experience in early childhood education than I have. I'm going to bring an additional perspective to our work in early childhood today, and that's a leadership perspective. I really enjoyed the first three major talks this morning. There were so many themes that came out of these talks that seem really important to me. One of them is that we've really come far as a nation and as a state in early childhood, but that we clearly have so far to go. And far to go not just in quantity of access to early childhood, but in quality of programs, quality of instruction that our young people are experiencing. I think it was Teresa who said it's going to be a big lift for us all to get where we need to be. Cindy's comments were particularly salient when she talked about her three major themes, which are high quality early childhood, high needs kids, and birth through three alignment. So I'm going to say something a little bit provocative today, and then I'm going to ask you a question. And the provocative thing I'm going to say is, think again about high quality early childhood, high needs kids, birth through three alignment, and the fact that we have a long way to go. What I'm going to say today is that we are not going to get there. We are just not going to get there unless we take seriously the development of leadership in the field of early childhood education. Now, I'll explain why that is in a minute, and I'll also try to leave you with some sense of optimism that we actually can do what needs to be done. First of all, I have a question. How many of you in the room here are actually practicing early childhood teachers? Could you just show of hands? We have a small group of those. How many of you are folks who are directly responsible for administrating or supporting through an administrative structure early childhood programming? Wow, okay. So teachers, you're outnumbered about 10 to 1. How does that feel? All right, horrible, somebody said. All right, let's get to work on this. I just want to show, I'm speaking from the position of my directorship of the Center for Urban Education Leadership in Chicago. We're moving in Chicago right now to developing principles for high needs schools at scale, meaning principles for every high needs school coming from a consortium of providers that prepare principals in a year-long, fully paid principal preparation program that's pre-K through 12. There's no other urban district in America that's doing this. We have now reached the point where we can fill every vacancy in Chicago with a principal from one of those programs, all right? Now, at the end of the talk here, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the progress that's being made. But just on that slide alone, you can see the map of the city of Chicago. We've produced, in our little program, over 100 principals for Chicago that are now serving in high-need Chicago schools at this moment. And a great many of them have really exemplary early childhood programs in those schools. All right, let's get to work here. Central ideas I want to talk about today. One of them is that, I'm Brian, am I dependent on this? I mean, I've got other mics. Should I just take this one aside? Okay, good. Can you still hear me okay now? Is it better? Okay, good. Overview of central ideas here. The first one is that pre-K through 3, or early child in general, and leadership are two of the most profoundly research-based levers for improving student learning K through 12. All right, and so we're going to talk today about an intersection of those two things. Second is the growth of pre-K in elementary schools and the importance of quality early childhood education for later learning. In other words, it's not just enough that we're reaching more kids with early childhood if we're not reaching them with quality early childhood. Thirdly, the notion of quality pre-K through 3 instruction or quality pre-K through 3 as an organizational property of the school. That this is not just about the talent of the teachers that you bring in. It's not just about the preparation of the teachers that you bring in, but that in fact, Early childhood programs, like schools in general, are dependent for the quality of their instruction on the quality of how the school is organized to develop that instruction and develop that, quote, teacher talent over time. The notion of developing and supporting school principals or center directors who get it, and the challenges that we have at multiple levels. There's also some very good news there that I'll share. And then finally, to talk a little bit about how higher education, state policy, and other agencies provide resources for the field, potentially at scale. All of us, we've known for a long, long time that you could create an exemplary early childhood program almost anywhere, in almost any neighborhood, in almost any locale. The challenge to us is, how do we do this at scale? How do we do this for all kids? How do we do it in all neighborhoods? And it sounds like a pipe dream even to talk that way, but I don't think it is. If we think strategically about leadership as a lever, there are reasons to believe that this is doable. I want to start with a systems theory insight here. And that is a phrase that many of you have heard, or a sentence many of you have heard, but most of us don't know where it came from, and the reason is nobody knows where it came from. The article by Carr is a nice discussion of the fact that nobody knows who first said this. And the saying is that your system, any system, is perfectly designed to obtain the results that you are obtaining. All right? If we make no changes, I mean, I really like, Teresa saying we've got a heavy lift here. If we make no changes in how early childhood education is supported and delivered, we will get the same results next year that we got this year. The system is set up to produce exactly that. The scary part of that is our current system of public school inequity is going to have to be disrupted in some significant way, or we'll get the same inequities next year and the year after and the year after that. I mean, look, we are over 30 years into a national school reform movement that for the most part has not worked. That for the most part has left the fundamental inequities of low-income kids, high-needs neighborhoods, and high-needs schools intact. And yet we've seen places where that's been challenged successfully and overcome, but not at scale. So today's talk is about sort of change agency at scale, and also about everybody in this room as having some change agency responsibilities. Principal development and pre-K through 3 alignment are key system components that can disrupt current outcomes. The challenge is, again, preparing and developing school and center leaders as change agents, because if we don't change the system, your system, any system, will continue to produce the results that we're currently getting. I'm going to make a detour to give you a case of where we really did change things. 100 years ago, the medical profession was structured pretty much the way principal preparation is structured today. This is one of the most famous examples in social science of a profession changing itself almost overnight. It was a 10-year period between 1910 and 1920. In 1909, when Abraham Flexner did a study for the Carnegie Foundation, the same Carnegie Foundation that still exists today, he found that medical education in general was non-selective in admissions. It was overwhelmingly non-selective. You could get into the U of I Medical School, for example, with a high school diploma. There was little formal connection to sites of practice such as hospitals and clinics, and that meant clinical experience were minimal. That meant you could be a doctor, you could become a doctor by reading about it in class, right? That's how you got your MD degree. And science of medicine was in its infancy, and we actually had pretty low expectations of medical practice. Doctors were the butt of lots of jokes. I mean, the term sawbones is a reference to doctors. Now, the truth is, this is where principal preparation stands today. Any teacher in America that wants a principal certificate can get one. It's thoroughly non-selective. We have little formal connection in principal programs to sites of practice that are extensive at all. Most principals get their principal's endorsement nationwide by doing very little field work and usually almost no supervised field work. You do a project in the school, and that's your field work. I mean, we're 100 years behind the medical profession in this. Now, there are a number of principal preparation programs that are challenging this and challenging at a deep level. Ours is one at UIC, but we're certainly not the only one. And now the state of Illinois, through legislation passed in the last few years, is now challenging this at every institution in the country. Just for an example, at every institution in the state. Just for an example, you can't have a principal preparation program in the state of Illinois anymore unless it is a clear partnership between higher ed and a school district, by law. And that already, I just attended a conference yesterday in the state, already that's had a profound impact on the voice that school districts have over the quality of the principals that get prepared. Why? Because school districts pay the price when principals are not prepared the way they need to be prepared. Higher ed pays no price at all, right? In fact, it's better for us if we turn out more principals, regardless of how qualified they are, because we get the tuition. And what the state of Illinois has done now is just really put a clamp on that and said, look, every single program has to be a clear partnership between districts and higher ed. So let me go forward on this a little bit. Here you have the entire history of my education in the field of education itself. You're going to recognize a lot of this. When I first started as an undergraduate in college, I was taught in sociology of ed that socioeconomic status is the prime contributor to student learning outcomes. And moreover, the Harvard studies done by Coleman and Jenks in the 60s said, and there's nothing that can be done about that. If you go back and read those books, they not only say, I mean, Christopher Jenks' book, Inequality, for example, they not only say the prime determinant of student learning is SES, but schools essentially can't have an impact on that. Now, this history is inconsistent from the beginning, and here's what I mean by that. At the same time, we were starting Head Start programs. My first exposure to early childhood was in the late 60s in Head Start programs, and Head Start was premised on the view that you could do something about it. But the major research studies coming out at that time said, probably not. It's not going to happen. By the 70s, we started to see some effective schools research that showed that, wait a minute, there are schools in some neighborhoods that are really high-need schools where kids are performing above socioeconomic status. Not many, but there are a few. And that in every single one of those, there was a very strong school leader present to support teachers in meeting the kids' learning needs. Every single one. By 1980, A Nation at Risk, 1983, under the Reagan administration, essentially took over the school reform movement, launched 30 years of teacher ed reform. And I underline teacher to say our focus then and right through No Child Left Behind was on fixing teachers. If we could just fix teachers, and Arnie Duncan to this day will say, we need more talented teachers. And what I want to show today is that there's a real problem in that way of thinking. My guess is that teachers are probably talented enough. But what we're not doing is supporting those teachers once they get into the profession to continue to develop the learning that they've done in their pre-service programs. By the 1990s, we had our first really convincing evidence that what matters most in student learning, particularly low-income kids' learning, is the quality of classroom instruction. If a kid comes from an upper middle class background, brings cultural capital to the school that's quite significant, mediocre teaching probably won't hurt that kid very much. But that kind of teaching doesn't help kids from low-income backgrounds who bring a very different kind of cultural capital to the school than that which is going to be tested on standardized exams. As late as 2001, No Child Left Behind virtually never mentioned school leadership as it focused on preparing teachers, better quality teachers. The idea was if you could just get more talented teachers, if you could support them better, in terms of their development, but it didn't think about the school as an organization, and it wasn't until 2010 that we saw a really influential book. This is one that I think every educator ought to own, called Organizing Schools for Improvement by Tony Bright, Penny Sebring, and the Consortium on Chicago School Reform. Why is this so important? Because here's what they did. They studied the schools in Chicago that were low income but high performing. And they compared those schools to schools that were also low income but low performing. And then they asked the question, what makes the difference? Why is it that some of these schools in the same neighborhoods with the same kids, with teachers from the same teacher ed backgrounds, are performing at a high level and others are not? By the way, I noticed some of you taking some notes, and I just want to say, sure, go ahead and do that, but also this is going to be available on the website, right? So that makes it real easy. But I mean, some people like taking notes, and I don't want to interfere with that. So, Bryk and Sebring come out in 2010 and they say, look, we've got 20 years of research here, and so you can focus on 5 things that really make a difference. 5 things that if even 3 of these are present in a school, that school's chances of having kids performing above their socioeconomic background predictors are going to be far greater than schools that don't have 3 of these operating. Just want to make sure I'm going to get to those eventually because I don't see them there. So we'll get there. So this is part of a national conversation where since the 1960s, since I was first exposed to sociology of education, and in my master's program at Erickson Institute, I had a sociology of ed course that introduced me to Christopher Jenks. The conclusion to the book Inequality was, since we now know that schools can't make a difference in low-income kids' learning, schools should at least be pleasant places to be, right? And this is a Harvard researcher, a sharp guy, concluding this. But it was kind of the state of thinking at that time. And look, our expectations have clearly changed, all right? This is another one of those we've come so far with so far to go moments. The national conversation has changed dramatically to what schools actually can do instead of what they can't. And school leadership research is changing this conversation again, from an emphasis on teacher quality as something residing in individual teachers to instructional quality that resides in schools as organizations. So one of the things that Bryk and Sebring, one of the central messages from that book, is that a school that's organized to support high-quality instruction can actually get it, regardless of where those teachers come from, regardless of what their teacher ed backgrounds are. They can learn together what it takes to meet the needs of kids. So teacher quality as a property that resides in individuals is something that we really need to question, although clearly some teachers are more committed and more motivated than others and have better backgrounds than others and so on. But what we're seeing is that organizations can develop any teacher who wants to develop into someone who better serves the needs of kids. So this is part and parcel of the recent discovery of school leadership. My dad was a school principal in Springfield, Illinois. And my dad is fond of saying, he wouldn't let me quote this in a book because he was embarrassed about it, but he's fond of saying, when I was a principal, nobody expected me to improve student test scores. And yet now we are expecting that of principals. We're saying to principals, look, we know that a good school can actually elevate measures of student learning. And I'm not putting all my eggs in the standardized testing basket here. But all kinds of measures of student learning can be affected by strong leadership. And if that's the case, why aren't we getting it from all leaders? And the challenge then is the preparation and the development of leaders. By the way, those of you who at one time or other in your life were teachers can remember, I mean, I do this with teachers at various stages in their career, and I developed a new teacher mentoring program for the city of Chicago in the late 90s. If you ask of an accomplished teacher in their 5th or 6th year teaching to assess for you how good their teaching was in their 1st year, they say things like, I should have been fired or arrested. Now, that sounds like an exaggeration, but the truth is, the work that we're up against as teachers and as leaders is so complex that it's really kind of silly to expect people to master it in the teacher ed programs that we have, even the good ones. There's so much teacher learning that goes on for those teachers who commit to it after the certificate. That's where most teacher learning takes place. By the way, you know, I think what I'm doing today in my work in early childhood is trying to make amends for what a bad early childhood center director I was also. I'm serious. We knew so little at that time about what it really took. We know so little, for example, about the complexities of math instruction in preschool that we now know so much more about. I honestly did this, so I'm going to tell you. I remember one time I was so impressed with a paper I wrote for Erickson on classroom management, early childhood education, that for professional development, I read the paper to my staff. I thought they need to hear this, you know. So this is an example of somebody who is discovering how to be an early childhood leader on his or her own. And unfortunately, the profession is very much like that today. Those of us who lead early childhood programs largely have to discover how to do this on our own because higher ed is not getting the job done in terms of preparing the leadership that teachers and kids really deserve. So, I'm going to skip this last couple of bullets here because I'm going to say it in a different way. I'm playing with this. There's a cliche in the field of leadership development now, and if you study much leadership literature at all, you'll run into this. It's the most quoted comment in leadership literature right now. It is that leadership is second only to classroom instruction among all school-related factors that contribute to what students learn. So Karen Seashore Lewis found the same thing 6 years later. She says we're more confident than ever about that claim. Here's what I want to say is problematic about that. The reality is that it's absolutely true that low-income kids, high-needs kids, absolutely need high-quality instruction if they're going to succeed. And that's the proximate variable that makes a difference. The trouble is, you're not going to get high-quality instruction classroom after classroom after classroom in a school unless you have school leadership that knows how to develop and support it. So there's a sense in which strong school leadership is a necessary condition if we're going to get high-quality instruction at any grade level at scale. And so to say it's second in importance is a little misleading. It's kind of a statistical artifact. If you do a regression, you come out with teachers showing higher impact than principals. Absolutely right. The trouble is, if we don't get the school leadership right, there's very little hope of getting the teaching right. All right? So Breich and others have contributed to our understanding there, and here it is. What they say is, if you get 3 out of these 5 right in a school, you can have a much deeper impact on student learning, a measurable impact, a statistically significant impact. And we're working with principals now who are getting all 5 of these on an upward trajectory. It's not unreasonable to expect that at all. The first of these, Breich and Sebring say, is the most important, because if you don't do the first one, you're not going to get the other 4. All right? So Charles Payne, who's the author of a book that many of you might know, it's called So Much Reform, So Little Change, the American Public Schools. And what he's talking about is 30 years of reform, and the inequities have fundamentally not shifted, right? Why is that? What is it about our reform measures that are not taking root? And he cites this book as a way forward. He cites Breich and Sebring as a way forward. And so this very second one on the list here is one that early childhood educators know deeply and know well. And in fact, brand new book out that I'm going to talk a little bit more later about. It's available to you until November 15th. You know this one, right? This is the National Association of Elementary School Principals. It's on the website until, I'll put it up in a few minutes, until the 15th of November, and then they're going to sell it for money. So if you want to download it, yeah. It's on the forum on page 2. It's on our forum webpage. Oh, also. Terrific. So if you go to the center's webpage, then State Forum. Okay, thanks. You can get this link and down. Now, why am I saying this? It features UIC, my program briefly in a pull-out box, but specifically it features one of our teachers, one of the principal preparation coaches in my program, Dr. Kathleen Mayer, who for 16 years was principal in back of the yards school called Rachel Carson. And Rachel Carson got all kinds of national attention because she had 1,300 low-income kids, and these kids were outperforming state averages for all kids. And how did that happen? And Kathleen says it could not have happened without her starting a pre-K in that K through 8 school. And one of her arguments was not just what we would ordinarily expect about the kind of a head start theory here. These kids are getting a head start. We're going to continue working. But also her idea was parents are most amenable to forming relationships with schools at that preschool age. And if you can get your hooks into parents at the preschool age, you'll have your hooks into them at the 8th grade level when you really need to have your hooks into them, right? And so, I mean, just something as simple as that idea. So the question is, how many principals really understand that? How many of them understand the power of the pre-K to have an impact on grade 3, grade 8? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Professional capacity of teachers. How well does the school organize the professional development and growth and voice of teachers? How much do they get a voice in actually making decisions about curriculum, instruction, and assessment? Student-centered learning climate, and finally, instructional guidance, meaning to what extent are teachers actually developing in their ability to deliver high-quality instruction, right? Because if teachers don't develop and stay at the level they were the first year out of their teacher ed program, this is not good for kids because the teachers are not yet where they need to be when they first get out of teacher ed. And I'm speaking as a teacher educator, right? I mean, I was head of curriculum instruction at Urbana for many years, and that's, I've got a book out that's, been in print for 20 years on teacher ed, but I know the limitations of pre-service teacher education. Here's a very explicit theory of why leadership matters, and this is true for every grade level. It's true for pre-K, it's true for high school. The idea here is this. All of us in this room are interested in this, right? Whatever your definition of student learning is, what we're trying to do is to address inequities of student learning and support kids learning at the level that we already know they're capable of. The science is clear. What's stopping these kids from learning is not the kids, right? It's how we're organizing our schools to support their learning. So the question is, how do you do that? And one of the ways you do that, the most primary way of doing it, is by improving the quality of classroom instruction in every classroom. This is not teacher bashing. This is not saying teachers don't know what they're doing. It's saying that what we know for sure now is that some schools are capable of engaging teachers in continuous improvement of their own craft as long as they're in that school. And that as new teachers come in, those new teachers are inducted into that highly developed craft of teaching. And then the question becomes, how do you create such a school? And that goes to this box right here. How do you organize systems and structures in a school so that the first priority of the school is adult learning? I'll say Ounce of Prevention right now is doing some really interesting stuff with this in terms of creating professional development models that are embedded into the life of the school. So the first priority of the school is the adult learning that takes place in the school, because if the adults don't continue learning, they will not learn what they need to learn to serve the needs of the kids. We're not going to get those organizations, those systems, those structures set up where teachers meet with each other around problems of practice unless, in fact, we have school leaders that know how to do that. So what this is a very explicit theory for why school leadership matters to student learning. The idea that it's second most important becomes kind of a not very useful notion. We're not going to get it pre-K through 3 without a school that's organized to support the pre-K through 3 alignment. You can't simply say, let's hire a bunch of pre-K through 3 teachers and let's make sure they align themselves. Go to it. It's not going to happen. And more discouraging, but I'm going to be a little more upbeat about this by the end, more discouraging, most principals don't know how to make it happen. They haven't had the training. If they're lucky, they're in districts where districts help them learn how to do this, but higher ed itself has been woefully inadequate in helping principals understand that pre-K through 3 continuum, that pre-K through 3 alignment. So let me talk about the nexus between pre-K and leadership. When I go to leadership conferences, national conferences on school leadership, early childhood is almost never mentioned. When I go to early childhood conferences, school leadership is almost never mentioned. These are two powerful levers for improving student learning pre-K through 12, and they reside in two communities that basically don't talk to each other. All right? Now, we're starting to see some exceptions to that. There's no doubt about it. But one of the things that I hope you come out of today's talk with is the notion of how important it is that we think about leadership as an ingredient in organizing pre-K through 3, organizing pre-K in such a way that it continues to support adult learning and teacher development. This is the Rachel Carson school principal in Chicago who says, I couldn't have done it without the program. There's a sense in which quality instruction, quality integration from age 3, and of course, as we heard from Cindy, birth through 3, it's just that in most schools we're not dealing with birth through 3 right now, really requires quality school leadership. Too often these are in very separate conversations. Let me tell you one big exception to that. I was just asked to speak last week at the National Pre-K through 3 Center at University of Washington. Do you know that one? What a phenomenal resource, whether you're a teacher or a leader. They have a new framework for planning, implementing, and evaluating pre-K through 3 grade approaches. I'll mention it in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I'm mentioning it now to say it's not that nobody is talking about this intersection between leadership and early childhood. It's just that we're not seeing enough of it. And one of the real exceptions to that is the National Pre-K through 3 Institute, and of course, Ounce and Prevention in Chicago, I would have to cite as another exception to that. So what's the challenge then? The challenge is, how do we create leaders at scale who get it, right? Here's the formula. If you get the right leadership who can create the organizations, the systems, the structures, and the routine. What are systems and structures anyway? They're routines. Schools that are highly successful with low-income kids have very different routines than schools that are not. They put routines in place where adults are increasingly in control of their own learning. This is not about bringing an expert to deliver a PD. It's about building professional development into the daily life of the school and the daily discourse among the adults. Quality pre-K then is an organizational property of the school where we have instruction, integration, assessment, and adult learning on the same page. Now, here's why there's reason to be optimistic about this. Let me just take the case of the public school in general. I'm fully aware that, look, I started out my pre-K career not in a public school. Started out a full-day, 12-month kindergarten, federally funded at Hull House in uptown Chicago. And to this moment, an enormous percentage of kids are getting preschool education outside the public school. But let me talk about the public school, which is a growing site for pre-K, right? As I think that our speakers this morning were on target. The conversation is clearly shifting, and we're seeing public schools and public school districts embrace the pre-K challenge in ways that they never have before. That was a signal for me just to get off the stage, is what that meant. Here's the deal. You got 4 million teachers in America who have a very high turnover. The modal years of teaching, the number of years of teaching experience, according to the Center for Policy Research and Education, Richard Ingersoll, the number of years that more teachers have of experience than any other year, think for a minute about what I'm going to say. What's your guess? What's the number of years that more teachers have than any other year of experience? 1. In other words, that's how bad teacher turnover is. There are more first-year teachers in America than there are second year or third year or fourth year or fifth year. And if you start to figure out the math, you can see why that is, right? It's because we still have some teachers who have 30 years of experience. There are not very many, but a lot less of them than there are 1 year, of experience. You follow? So most of the teaching force is spread out along this continuum, but the years of experience that more teachers have than any other one is 1. Now, this really raises the stakes for leadership and organizations, right? These are rookies who are going to really need some significant support if they're going to succeed, and that means that those teachers who are staying on have to be instrumental in the development of adults in the school. So you got 4 million teachers with high turnover, but you only have 100,000 principals in America. And that means you only have a turnover each year of about 10,000. And we have hundreds and hundreds of higher ed institutions to produce those principals. Let's just take Illinois because we can get our arms around it. Annually, there's only about 400 vacancies a year in Illinois. We only have to prepare 400 high-end principals a year in Illinois. My high school class was twice the size of that. This is, as Jeff Mays of the Illinois Business Roundtable said, what it would take to provide a really high-end residency-based experience for that many principals a year in their principal prep programs would be a rounding error on the state of Illinois education budget. In other words, we are now moving to the place where every principal in the state will be trained with pre-K, and including a required pre-K field experience for that principal. All right? This is now law. This is the law. So yesterday, and I have a task force that I'm co-chairing with Diane Rutledge of the Large Unit District Association. We're co-chairing a task force to help people implement that law. So we have stakeholders from all over the state, including early childhood, including higher ed, and every place in between, to say, what's it going to take for principal prep programs to pull this off? Because right now, most principals do not have much of a clue about early childhood. And I'm not being disrespectful about that. The reality is, that's not where they came from. I've interviewed several hundred candidates for my principal preparation program over the past 11 years. Fewer than 10 out of those several hundred had early childhood backgrounds. Early childhood folks are not part of the pipeline to leadership. And so one of my early childhood professor colleagues said, well, you got a kind of a choice here. Are you going to try to turn school leaders into early childhood experts? You're going to try to turn early childhood experts into school leaders. And there's a sense in which we got to do some of both, right? We have to do it both ways. But the point is, the knowledge base of school leaders about early childhood and about the pre-K through 3 curriculum is right now not up to the task in front of us. That's not to say it can't be made up to the task, because I think it can. All right. So what's the challenge to institutions of higher ed and school districts? I held up a moment ago this National Association for Elementary School Principals. This is the second edition of this. I used the first one in my program quite a bit. This is a much better edition. And they say, hey, look, higher ed and school districts have to work together to do 6 things. If you can do these 6 things right, you're going to have a big impact on principals. One of them is help principals get this continuum and why it matters. I'm going to show you some data at the end to kind of bring this home. Secondly is principals need to understand what developmentally appropriate teaching is and learn how to support it. Look, if all principal activity and all teacher activity is going to be driven by standardized achievement tests, we got some real problems on our hands. In other words, the expertise of teachers and principals has to go way beyond what's tested in standardized achievement tests. The notion of providing personalized learning environments, and you can read the rest for yourself. I don't need to walk you through that. But what's cool is that these folks are saying, look, districts, if you can get these 6 things right, you've got a real chance of making a huge difference in pre-K through 12 learning by starting with a focus on early childhood education. So I applaud the National Association of Elementary School Principals, because for many years they didn't get into the early childhood game at all. But increasingly, early childhood is a part of the work of principals. What would it look like to prepare such principals is the question. Is this realistic? State of Illinois is certainly being recognized as one of those states that's out in front in this effort. I want to thank the lighting people for keeping things interesting for this. What would it look like to prepare? So here's what we do. And the state of Tennessee has basically adopted this entire model and made a presentation to the governor on this, the state leadership education agency and the state agency of Tennessee. They've gone to the governor with this and say, look, could we put this whole thing in place? And they've gone us one better. State of Tennessee has proposed not only that they have a full year paid residency for everybody accepted into a principal program, but that they pay the first year's tuition for every one of those people as well. All right? Look, it's just not that expensive because there's not that many of them. Tennessee can do this with 200 new principals a year, right? What an impact on low-income neighborhoods if you get the right principal in place. And I'm going to demonstrate that impact at the end. I keep telling you that because I don't want to lose you. So what would it look like? So here's what we do. First and foremost, we have a partnership with Chicago Public Schools, which is now mandated by law for every principal program in the state. Secondly, we do it pre-service and in-service. Our principals are with us in their development program, first 18 months until licensure. The next 3.5 years, they get intensive coaching as well as classwork to support their development as pre-K through 12 leaders. And by the way, just as an aside, the reason it's so effective to give them that ongoing coaching is our placement rate for 11 years has been 99% of our candidates who got through the residency are now principals or assistant principals, right? This is, in other words, if you get the job done right, people want your folks. If you select people who are committed to the principalship, as opposed to the past state of Illinois practice where 15% of our graduates of our Type 75 programs became principals or assistant principals, we're talking 99% for our program. And that's doable. We're not alone in that. There are other programs that are having similar results. Secondly, you've got to have high selectivity for program admissions. Not everybody is cut out to do this kind of work. It's one thing to work with kids effectively. It's another thing to work with adults effectively. Because I was good with kids, I thought I'd be good with adults. As one senior principal once said to me, "Oh no, honey, that's not how it works." Right? Adults are a very different breed of cat, and not everybody is good with adults, right? And learning to do that is a learning of a different craft and a different skill set. I mentioned that we have a full year paid residency. Chicago pays our teachers who are becoming principals for 1 year at an administrative salary. I mentioned the post-residency coaching. And then the idea that I have to say is we could not have pulled off this demonstration model for the last 11 years without external funding. And those of us who are sort of on the edge of change, Teresa said it's a heavy lift. If you're committed to change, I think you have to be committed to relationships with external funders as well. Because once the external funding helps you demonstrate what's possible, then it becomes reasonable for states and districts to invest in this the way that we're seeing in Illinois. I mentioned UT Knoxville, University of Tennessee Knoxville, the New York City Leadership Academy, Gwinnett County, Georgia, and other institutions around the country are matching our results. This is doable. And look, we're just a mid-level research institution. We're not Harvard, we're not Stanford. If we can do it, it can be done by others. Implications for a state systemic approach. Here's where the Cowers and Kaufman work out of University of Washington becomes really important. Also, the recommendations from National Association of Elementary School Principal. Both of them raise leadership expectations at every step. So I want to spend just a moment on that. If we're serious about expecting more of kids, that means we have to expect more of schools. Period. Right? If we're going to expect more of schools, we have to expect more of school leaders. It's just not going to work otherwise, right? And if we don't expect more of school leaders and prepare them to deliver at a higher level than we've expected in the past, we will not be able to meet our raised expectations for kids. We have 30 years of school reform that makes that pretty clear. These elements in the Cowers and Kaufman book on a state systemic approach really support our three speakers already today. The idea of cross-sector work. The idea that we've got to have different communities talking to each other about how to pull this off. Why? Because if you don't disrupt the current system, we'll get the same results that we've been getting. It takes disruptive dialogue to examine how do we create change, and it takes people like the folks in this room saying, I want to be a part of that change. I want to be a part of making this different. Even if I'm only making it different in my school, all of a sudden that school, like Kathleen Mayer's school, becomes proof that it can be different, right? And so any one of you who has the ambition to really see things change in your own environment, ultimately you become part of the evidence proof that it can be different all over. There's a great quote by Ron Edmonds. This comes out of the 1970s. Maybe you've heard this one. Ron Edmonds was the sort of the leader of the effective schools movement. And he said, I'm going to get this pretty close because I quote it in some of my writing. He said, how many schools do you need to see in which low-income children achieve high academic levels before you know that it can be done in all such schools? He said, then he goes on, this is the best part. He said, I suggest if you need to see more than one such example, then you have your own reasons for believing poor kids can't achieve. Ooh, right? It's true, right? Once you start to see it happen, you go, man, we should be doing this everywhere. And it's not impossible to do it. And what I'm sharing today is I think it is impossible if we don't get the leadership part right. Because the school as an organization is what ultimately supports teacher and student success. And then we find on down toward the bottom, family engagement again. This is also one of the 5 essential supports. Instructional tools, and we see the state playing a significant role in developing standards and assessments for instructional tools, and so on. All right, now I want to give you a little data. This is really interesting. This is meant to be very, very hopeful for all of us. What you see here doesn't make sense at first, but if you can see pink, you'll get everything you need out of this slide, all right? What this slide shows is Chicago Public Schools student test scores on the ISAT in reading, and math in 2001. Grade 3 only, compared to the state of Illinois excluding CPS. So what we have here is CPS versus the rest of the state in 2001, math and reading, but this little cell is only for black kids. This is African American boys and girls, free and reduced lunch eligible and not free and reduced lunch eligible, above the free and reduced lunch line. You follow? So we've got the poorest African American kids and the not poorest African American kids. And what we find is if you make comparisons of those kids to all Chicago's African American kids, to all the state's African American kids, Chicago's kids in 2001 lagged behind at the third grade level in reading and math. And the reason we know they lag behind is we compare raw test scores on the ISAT, and we find that the girls lagged 5.3 points behind in reading, and they lagged 5.7 points behind in math. The boys did a little bit better, but every place you see pink means Illinois is beating Chicago. All right? That's in 2001. The next slide will show you not just black kids in third grade, it's going to show you black, Hispanic, and white kids in grades 3, 5, and 8. So let's take a look at that. So again, if you can see color, that's all that's really necessary. But what we see here is grade 3, grade 5, grade 8, reading and math, reading and math, reading and math. And then we see African American kids, Latino kids, and white kids. And all of these kids, free and reduced lunch, non-free and reduced lunch, boys and girls. What this does, it compares apples to apples. It compares black kids in Chicago to black kids in the rest of the state. White kids in Chicago to white kids in the rest of the state at grades 3, 5. Now what you see is, in 2001, it's still mostly pink. Mostly the state is clobbering Chicago. But the tan portions show you there's no statistical difference. So the truth is we're not doing that well in most of the state on those tan areas. And the few green spots you see are where Chicago is actually performing better than the rest of the state. And most of those are like 8th grade, African American 8th graders in reading and math, Latino 8th graders in reading, and white kids 8th grade reading. They're doing a little bit better. Now, there's a whole argument for why that is that I won't get into, but it raises questions about whether the middle school model is academically really effective, because Chicago is a pre-K through 8 city and always has been. And it seems weird to think that pre-K through 8 might be more effective in terms of supporting kids' development than the middle school model or the junior high model, but there at least is some evidence that it is, and it's not just Chicago evidence. All right, so it's just something to think about. But I'm going to take it further than that. Let's go from 2001 to 2012. In the next chart, you're going to see all the green stuff. First of all, the pink stuff is going to be where the state is beating Chicago. The tan stuff is where it's a wash. And the green stuff is where Chicago is now outperforming the state of Illinois. So let's see if we see any more green on this one. No pink. There's no grade level for any demographic group where the rest of the state of Illinois is doing better than Chicago, and in fact, most of them, Chicago is doing better. Now, preschool for all kicked in 2006, and as we mentioned today, it's not implemented at a high level of fidelity anywhere in the state yet, right? In other words, we're not where we need to be. But school leadership kicked into Chicago a decade ago with the most concentrated effort at school leadership in the country, at school leadership development, and so what we're investigating right now is, to what extent did school leadership help to prepare this kind of change? Given that Chicago now supplies its whole pipeline of leaders from residency-based, full-year, full-paid resident principal preparation programs that are now pre-K through 12. Actually, we started our pre-K through 12 before it became state law. Now, I'm not telling you that leadership caused this, so don't misunderstand me on this. What I'm saying is we need to investigate the extent to which leadership really plays a role here. And we need to investigate the extent to which the intersection between pre-K through 3 and leadership plays a role. The funding community has been extensively engaged in the leadership initiative as well as the early childhood initiative, And look, yesterday I presented that same slide to the state task force, and one of the state legislators came up to me and he said, "Does anybody know this yet?" and I said, "No, because we haven't released it yet. So we're going to do a big press release and all that sort of stuff. But we're going to have to be honest, we can't yet explain fully that shift. But what we do know is black kids in the city of Chicago are outperforming their counterparts in the rest of the state, and that's true for Hispanic kids and it's true for white kids as well, above and below the free and reduced lunch line." Now, the research agenda is then what part did each of the elements play, and one of the things that we're going to hypothesize is this. School reform, including pre-K through 3, in the absence of strong leadership, is not likely to produce much results. In other words, poor school leadership, or even average school leadership, tends not to move the needle for kids no matter what new school reform program you put in the school. But when you have strong leadership, school reform initiatives, whether they're pre-K, whether they're reading, whether they're mathematics and science, whatever, when you have strong leadership, there's a multiplier effect on those school reform initiatives that helps them succeed. All right? And what we're hypothesizing is Chicago is becoming a real clear case of this over time. The reason I say that is New Leaders for New Schools and University of Illinois Chicago together alone have put over 275 new principals into Chicago in the last decade. Just these two tiny programs. An enormous footprint on the city of Chicago coming out of two small programs. Can't we do 400 a year in the state of Illinois? Pre-K trained, and the answer is yeah, we can. All right? Goes back to your system, any system. We have local district resources. There are district representatives in this room who can really take responsibility for making sure principals and teachers get their hands on the best standards, the best resources in pre-K, the best resources in leadership development of teachers so that schools become adult learning environments first and foremost. Secondly, there are all kinds of state resources, including those coming directly out of the center. This meeting is an example of that. Institution of Higher Ed resources. Illinois State University is producing some really interesting stuff that are curricula for the development of higher ed, of principals in higher ed institutions in partnership with school districts. New Leaders for New Schools, now called New Leaders, has produced some really good early childhood stuff with McCormick Foundation funding. UIC has as well. And of course, I mentioned a couple of the national resources earlier. Okay, so I'm going to stop at that point because that's a lot for you guys to sort of digest and absorb. And they have agreed with me that we could at least try a little Q&A, even though this room is not set up perfectly for that, because I thought it'd be interesting to get comments from a couple of you on what you're seeing here. And if you have questions at all, I'm open to questions as well. And we even have a mic that we can bring back to you. Somebody had volunteered to do some mic running. Try your teacher voice, and let's see if I can repeat the question.
Okay, as I was listening to you talk about leadership and how important that is, I was also thinking about preschool for all and the effect that that's had on our private sector. We're not in a school district. We're a private facility. We're funded for 80 kids.
Yeah.
Our local school district has about 15 children, but we've had a very big struggle trying to work together. So when I hear you talking about pre-K to 8 and the school districts being key to that, it seems to me that it is easier, cheaper, and makes a whole lot of a difference if the school district invests in the daycare center in the local communities, and they raise that level. I know when Preschool for All came into our center, it raised the level of quality by 100. It is unreal, and it's really a fabulous place to be for the kids. And we have seen a huge difference in teachers, what we can afford. It's difficult to provide high quality without funding. And so instead of being a competitor with the public schools.
So let me repeat your question for everybody in a more condensed form, because I think I think that's right on. So the question is really, hey, wait a minute. Preschool for All isn't just taking place in public schools. We're seeing preschool of all kinds of things taking place in many locales, more of it outside the public schools than in. Are we seeing the kind of relationships between the public school district and all those providers that we need to be seeing? And I'll tell you that the models for the relationships between the districts and those providers runs the gamut. from no relationship at all to some really strong relationships, so that principals, for example, who have kindergarten and first grade know the providers in their district and in their neighborhood and have a relationship with them and so on. So this is almost a better question for Cindy, for example, to deal with than it is for me. But it really is true. I think you're onto something terribly important here. In other words, we are not systemic yet about how it is that we offer preschool. And we can't say, well, someday it'll all be in the public schools. That's not on the horizon right now. So the question is, how do we get school districts, public schools, and local providers who are outside the schools to have relationships with one another that really support the kids' transition? So I think you're right on target. So, other questions, comments? Yeah. Thanks for running the mic around. That's really appreciated.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got the leadership model. One of the things that I find as a leader that came up and learned, not being a pre-K person, is there's one more barrier. Is there any possibility of this filtering up to the superintendency as well? Just the basic understanding, if nothing else, to get out of the way.
Okay. Before I answer that, are there any superintendents that want to raise their hand? Okay, so that's good. We have some in the room. So let me say this. One of the most successful superintendents in America is Jerry Wiest. Some of you know of Jerry's work in Montgomery County, outside Washington, D.C. He had just a profound impact on student learning outcomes pre-K through 12 in Montgomery County over a 16-year period, and is now making his career as somebody talking about what he accomplished. It's no question it's a big deal. And in fact, he recently spoke at the National Pre-K through 12 Institute. He also spoke at Erickson Institute recently. And Jerry was telling his story about how he was able to so dramatically improve student learning outcomes and college attendance, particularly for low-income and minority kids in Montgomery County. You can look this up on the web under WEAST, Jerry Wiest, Montgomery County. There's a bunch of stuff on it. And I said, Jerry, you're telling a story of superintendency excellence here, and we all believe it. We all, the evidence is there. You did a phenomenal job. But talk to us a little bit about what role school building leaders played in that. What role did the principals play in your being able to do this? Because every good superintendent of a district of any size, now, let me just take a parenthesis here. There are some districts in America where the superintendent has only one school in the district. Illinois has over half of those in the entire United States. It's a goofy model. I mean, it's one of the reasons we have 800 school districts in the state of Illinois. However, that model aside, if a superintendent has any significant number of principals, every superintendent knows it's very difficult to succeed without good school leadership. So I raised that question for Jerry Wiest, and he said, we said, yeah. He said, I had to actually replace 90% of my principals. Now, all I'm saying about that is that good superintendents know they've got to get strong building level leadership. So I don't think it's about getting out of the way, honestly. I mean, I think everything we know about good district level leadership is that good district level leadership ultimately supports the relationship between the child and the teacher in the classroom. And you can't do it effectively unless you support your principals. So I think it's an alignment issue, and I do think superintendents are going to have to get this message big time, and state of Illinois, I think, can play a significant role in doing that. Several of our principals have now gone on to the superintendency, and I'm just excited about what they're doing because they know how to support principals, they know how to support teachers. Other questions? Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Golden Apple Scholars Program, and do you attribute any of that leadership in Chicago to that program, and do you see that funneling down to Southern Illinois?
I've been familiar with Golden Apple since they first started. So here's a very interesting history there. I'll make this fairly quick. Mike Koldyke began funding Golden Apple. He was the founder of it, some 20 plus years ago, because he thought if we could just bring a spotlight to great teaching, this would have an impact on the profession. But what he began to see was bringing a spotlight to a handful of great teachers every year really didn't affect the fundamental inequities that were ongoing in public schools. Why? Because they're systemic. So he took another step. He said, why don't we get into the business of training teachers to be like these Golden Apple teachers? So he opened the Academy for Urban School Leadership in Chicago to do residency-based teacher training. So they're one of the most acknowledged programs in the country on a full-year residency-based student teaching experience post-baccalaureate. They recruit people already with baccalaureates, usually in liberal arts and sciences, give them a full year with a master teacher. Well, that turned out to be very expensive, and Mike got frustrated for the following reason. Once you take your 30 teachers that went through that process and put them in 30 different schools, the schools don't change. Some few lucky kids have a good teacher that year, but the fundamental inequities don't change. So he went to Arnie Duncan, because Arnie was superintendent at that time. He said, Arnie, could you give us some schools so I could just put all my teachers in those schools? And Arnie said, well, I can't exactly do that, but let's see what we can work out. And eventually what they worked out was this, that the AUSL, Academy for Urban School Leadership, turnaround school program. So all this noise you heard about Chicago shutting down schools over the last year, several of those schools, quite a number of them, the total is now over 30 AUSL turnaround schools, quite a number of them dismissed all the teachers and then allowed AUSL to put its teachers in place and to hire new teachers. So that what you do is, the idea is it's like an oil change, right? You get rid of all the teachers in the building, replace them with all new teachers and a new principal, and the idea is what you're going to get out of that is a higher performing school. Now, I'll also tell you, naturally they go after the best principals they can find. They early on figured out, if we don't have good principals, this doesn't work. So they go after my principals, for one thing, right? So that's why I'm so terribly familiar with what they're doing. Now, what that tells us, however, is that Mike took a while to come to the understanding that it's systemic. I can't just train some good teachers and hope that that changes the system, because it won't. What I need to do is take over a whole building, and then I can produce some results. The trouble is, after 10 years of this, he's got 33 schools in a school system with 650 schools. Do you see why that's not a very good systemic solution, right? So a much faster and deeper systemic solution is go after the building leadership and develop that leadership. Look how fast we've put over 270 principals in Chicago during that same time. I was on since this is crossing, I mean, some of you in here might be advocates of the charter schools, and with our new governor, we're going to see more charter school dialogue on the table. I was on WTTW, the Chicago Public TV, one night in sort of a debate with the head of the Renaissance 2010 unit that was responsible for putting charter schools into Chicago. You know, we have over 100 of them now in Chicago. And she said toward the end of the debate, she said, look, I'm going to get $50 million new dollars from the business community to have more charter schools, so we're going to continue to grow this model. The charter school model is not much different from the AUSL school turnaround model. Start with all new teachers, new principal, and so on. And I said, geez, you know, for $50 million, I said, how about if we split it? You take 25 and I'll take 25. I'll do school leadership, you do charter schools, and let's see who gets the better results out of that, right? School leadership, you know, some people say, geez, Steve, you think school leadership is a silver bullet? And the answer is, I really don't. I think teachers are the silver bullet. But it takes strong school leaders to support teachers. It takes school leaders who get it to support high quality instruction and to develop that instruction. And Golden Apple came to that understanding after their first efforts at the Golden Apple teacher. They still do that. If you ask me what impact that really has on schooling and equity in Chicago, I'd say virtually none. And that's why AUSL went systemic with it. It's a nice honor for teachers, and it gives us a chance to spotlight good teaching, and I applaud that. But it is not a good theory of school change. Other questions, comments? There's one back there. Could you repeat the question?
I'm just curious if the principal training model that you have in that program in Chicago, is the Urbana campus looking at adopting that and expanding that to Central Illinois?
Those are my buddies over there. You know, I was born in Champaign, and I was a department chair in that building in Urbana for quite some time. I think that research universities have a tendency not to be very interested in very practice-intensive innovations like this, except to study it. And this is not a criticism, exactly. But I'm in a research university, and we're trying to demonstrate that you can do both. University Council for Ed Admin is the leading research organization in school leadership, and we were the first program that they identified as exemplary in the whole country. Now, the trouble is most university faculty did not become university faculty to do this kind of work. They became university faculty in research institutions. This sounds harsh, but to be left alone to do their own research. I mean, the autonomy of the university is very, very attractive to university faculty. Our program really reduces the autonomy for our faculty because we work in collaboration every single day, and we work in collaboration in ways that we expect our school principals to work in collaboration in their schools. And this is going to be, I'm going to say it for the third time, I was struck with Teresa's comment about the heavy lift. This is going to be a heavy lift for higher ed to be doing what we're doing. And I'm really proud of what Illinois is doing, because fortunately there's only 4 Research 1 institutions in Illinois in higher ed out of the 28 that are offering principalship programs. Most higher ed institutions in Illinois are embracing this and really going after it. It'll be interesting to see. I think Urbana will come up with its own model. It won't look like ours, but eventually they'll come up with a model that'll be worth paying attention to. Shall we take maybe one more? I saw one up front, yeah.
Steve, I'm just wondering, do you do mentorships if you haven't gone through the new school leaders for new principals? Is there something out of UIC that you could connect with as a new principal?
Yeah, let me make sure I'm understanding the question. Let me say the following, and you tell me whether this is responsive or not. Our program is designed in such a way that after everybody gets their license, and 99% of our people then become, last year was 100% of our people become school leaders, every one of them has a guaranteed coach for the next 3 years. And it's not a mentor in their building because they're the chief officer in their building. It is somebody who visits their building once a week and works with them on development of their leadership skills. Now, when they are in the pre-service phase, they have a 12-month residency where they have a mentor principal. And those mentor principals are selected very carefully by CPS and us together. So the mentoring phase is the pre-service. The post-mentoring phase is leadership coaching, where they do get what you might call, many people call it mentoring. Is that responding to what you're asking?
No, actually I'm asking if you're a principal at this time and you're seeking a mentor in something and you feel like you would align with your program and you go through it,
yeah.
Do they offer anything like that you could sign up for?
Yes.
Seeking your own mentorship?
Yes, CPS does. And by the way, the state of Illinois actually is pretty good at not consistently, but pretty good at funding first-year mentors for all principals in the state. It's actually a law in the books. The funding, as I say, is inconsistent, but most school districts are in fact pretty good about mentoring first-year principals. However, you're pointing out to a much larger problem here, so I want to spend just a minute on it. Okay, so let's say we do have a 10% turnover in the state of Illinois. 90% of the principals aren't turning over, and where are they getting their support, where are they getting their growth, and so on. This is very much going to have to be a school district responsibility, and enlightened superintendents are going to play critical roles in this. In New York City, the New York City Leadership Academy started out doing what we're doing, which is preparing a small cohort of principals every year. Mind you, if you do this right, in 10 years, you've replaced every single principal in Chicago, for example, third largest school district in the country, potentially now that we're up at scale. But in the meantime, what about the principals that want other kind of support? New York City Leadership Academy has an enormous set of support mentors in place right now, a whole cadre of mentors that are kind of replicating their work with practicing principals. We don't have the capacity to do that. Chicago Public Schools has put its own principal sort of development process in place. It was a $20 million project for them, and they took a lot of heat for doing it because it was done in a way that was not necessarily very consultative. However, that said, I think that the issue of the fact that there are practicing principals who need real job-embedded growth experiences nobody would disagree with that. We're not providing it at this moment because we're focusing everything on pre-service. Okay, I will take that as a sign that I am now off the hook. I really appreciate the dialogue. I appreciate the clear attentiveness that I experienced while I was giving the talk. I'm going to close with the following remark. Bobby Kennedy's son, Chris Kennedy, is chair of the Board of Trustees for all of University of Illinois, for all 3 campuses. And he came and spoke at the 10th anniversary of our program. And the room was full of principals and aspiring principals. And he said to them, look, if we're serious about a multicultural democracy that actually supports the all-around growth of everybody in our culture and not just some people, he said, clearly, you guys are on the front edge of that challenge. And I feel the same way about all of you. If we're serious about a multicultural democracy, early childhood education is absolutely on the front edge of that. So I applaud the work you're doing, and thank you for having me here today.